A billionaire CEO shocked the world when he retired at 45 to live with a homeless man who had tried to rob him at gunpoint. But what they discovered together changed everything they thought they knew about life, and their silence spoke louder than any words ever could. Richard Blackwood was a kind of man who commanded attention wherever he went. At 45, he stood 6 feet tall with silver-streaked hair, sharp blue eyes, and wore $1,000 suits like armor. As CEO of Blackwood Industries, a global tech empire worth $12 billion, he was known for his ruthless business tactics and 18-hour workdays. His penthouse apartment in Manhattan was filled with expensive art he never looked at. His garage housed cars he rarely drove, and his calendar was packed with meetings that meant everything and nothing all at once. Richard had built an empire, but had never built a life. On the other side of the city lived Danny Martinez, a 38-year-old man who looked decades older than his years. His face was weathered by addiction, homelessness, and a series of bad decisions that had led him from a promising career as a social worker to living under bridges and in abandoned buildings. Danny had been clean for 3 months, but his worn clothes, missing teeth, and hollow eyes told the story of a man who had lost everything: his job, his family, his home, and most importantly, his hope. He survived by doing odd jobs, collecting bottles, and when desperation hit its peak, by making choices he'd never imagined he'd make. The incident that changed both their lives happened on a cold Tuesday night in November. Richard was walking to his car after a late board meeting, talking on the phone about quarterly projections, when Danny emerged from the shadows of an alley. Shaking and desperate, Danny pulled out a small pistol, later revealed to be unloaded, and demanded Richard's wallet. "Give me everything you have," Danny said, his voice cracking with fear and shame. "I don't want to hurt you, man, but I haven't eaten in 3 days." Most people would have panicked, called security, or complied out of terror. But Richard, perhaps because he'd been numb to everything for so long, simply looked at Danny with curiosity rather than fear. He saw the trembling hands, the tears in the man's eyes, the way he kept apologizing even as he made his demand. "When's the last time you ate?" Richard asked calmly. Danny was so shocked by the question that he almost dropped the gun. "What?" "Food. When did you last eat?" Richard repeated. I don't know. Sunday, maybe? Look, just give me your wallet, and I'll leave you alone." Instead of handing over his wallet, Richard did something that surprised them both. "Put the gun down and come with me. I'll buy you dinner." What happened next unfolded over several hours and all-night diner, where Richard listened to Danny's story. Danny had been a social worker for 15 years, helping homeless individuals find housing and support services. His life had been stable until his wife died in a car accident, sending him into a spiral of grief and addiction. He'd lost his job, his apartment, and eventually his will to live. The robbery attempt was meant to get him enough money for drugs to make the pain stop permanently. "I wasn't trying to get rich," Danny explained, pushing food around his plate. "I was trying to get enough to end it all." Richard found himself more moved by this stranger's story than he'd been by anything in years. For reasons he couldn't explain, he made an offer that would change both their lives. "I have a cabin in upstate New York. It's been empty for years. You can stay there, get clean, figure things out. No strings attached." Danny was suspicious at first. "Why would you do that?" "I just tried to rob you." "Because," Richard said slowly, "I think we're both dying, just in different ways." The arrangement was supposed to be temporary. Richard would provide the cabin, some basic supplies, and Danny would have a safe place to recover. But when Richard drove Danny to the rustic cabin nestled in the Adirondack Mountains, something unexpected happened. The silence of the place, the absence of city noise, the simple beauty of the landscape, it all felt like a balm to Richard's overworked soul. "Mind if I stay the night?" Richard asked, surprising himself with the question. That one night turned into a weekend. The weekend turned into a week. Within a month, Richard had made a decision that shocked the business world. He was retiring immediately, selling his shares in the company, and disappearing from public life. The media went wild. Financial analysts called it everything from a nervous breakdown to a midlife crisis. His board of directors tried to have him declared mentally incompetent. His few remaining friends and family members were baffled. How could a man who had dedicated his entire life to building an empire just walk away? But Richard had found something in that cabin with Danny that he'd never experienced in his penthouse: peace. The two men developed an unlikely friendship built on shared silence and simple routines. Danny worked on his recovery, attending AA meetings in the nearby town, while Richard learned to chop wood, tend a garden, and cook simple meals. They would sit on the porch for hours without speaking, watching the seasons change, listening to the sounds of the forest. Danny taught Richard about survival, not the corporate kind, but the human kind, how to find meaning in small moments, how to be present without constantly planning the next move, how to find strength in vulnerability. Richard, in turn, helped Danny rebuild his confidence, encouraging him to pursue his passion for woodworking, something he'd abandoned years earlier. You know what's funny? Danny said one evening as they sat by the fire, "I spent years trying to help people find homes, and I never realized I was homeless myself. Not because I didn't have a place to live, but because I didn't know how to be at home with who I was." Richard nodded, understanding completely. "I had everything anyone could want, but I was empty inside. Success without purpose is just expensive emptiness." As months passed, the two men grew closer, their friendship deepening into something that transcended their vastly different backgrounds. They began working together on woodworking projects, creating beautiful furniture that they would give away to families in need. Danny's skills as a craftsman flourished, while Richard discovered creativity he'd never known he possessed. The transformation was remarkable. Danny gained weight, his eyes cleared, and his smile returned. Richard's stress lines faded. His hair grew longer, and he developed calluses on his hands for the first time in his life. They looked like different people. Healthier, happier, more alive. But the most profound change was in how they related to the world. They stopped following the news, stopped checking their phones obsessively, stopped measuring their worth by external standards. They created their own economy based on kindness, their own success metrics based on peace and contentment. The turning point came when a journalist tracked him down, hoping to write a story about the fallen CEO and the criminal who saved him. The reporter expected drama, conflict, or at least an interesting soundbite. Instead, he found two men who had found something so precious that they refused to cheapen it with explanations. "Why did you give up everything?" the journalist asked Richard. Richard looked at Danny, then back at the reporter. "I didn't give up everything. I found everything. And you," the journalist turned to Danny, "what do you say to people who think you're taking advantage of this man's generosity?" Danny was quiet for a long moment. "I say that generosity isn't something you take. It's something you receive and then give back to the world." After the journalist left, having failed to get the sensational story he'd wanted, Richard and Danny made a pact. They would no longer speak to the media, no longer explain their choices to a world that couldn't understand them. Their silence became their protection, their shield against a society that demanded their story fit into neat categories of success and failure, victim and villain, normal and abnormal. Years passed. The media eventually lost interest. Richard's former associates assumed he'd had a breakdown and moved on. Danny's old friends from the streets either didn't recognize him or respected his new life too much to disturb it. The two men continued their quiet life in the mountains, creating beauty with their hands, helping their neighbors when needed, and finding joy in the simple rhythm of days measured by sunrise and sunset rather than stock prices and quarterly reports. Richard never regretted his decision to walk away from billions of dollars. Danny never returned to his old life of addiction and desperation. They had found something more valuable than money or even sobriety. They had found purpose, peace, and the rare gift of true friendship. Their story became a local legend, whispered about in a nearby town with a mixture of confusion and respect. Some people called them crazy. Others called them wise. But Richard and Danny no longer care about labels or explanations. They had learned that the most profound transformations happen not in boardrooms or rehab centers, but in the quiet moments when two broken souls recognize each other and choose to heal together. Their silence wasn't about hiding from the world. It was about protecting something sacred from a world that too often mistakes noise for meaning. Sometimes the greatest success story is the one that never gets told, and the richest life is the one that can't be measured in dollars and cents. True wealth isn't about what you accumulate. It's about what you're willing to leave behind to find what your soul actually needs. If you like that story, please subscribe for more. Thank you, and until next time.